Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody who follows this channel. Today we're going to talk about Flavius Josephus as he explains the way Rome took control over Jerusalem. You see, for those of us who study the Bible, it is very important to know about Flavius Josephus and his writing. There is no way you can correctly understand what's going on in the Bible if you're not aware of what Flavius Josephus wrote. You see, to properly understand the Bible, you need to understand the context, the historical, political, and social context that's going on in the Bible. Otherwise, you're going to be misunderstanding what's really going on in Scripture. Because now, it doesn't matter what Bible you read, both Bibles have a major gap, a major historical gap that is filled in and detailed with detailed explanations by Flavius Josephus. If you look at the Protestant Bible ends with people being taken captives into Babylon. No, actually, it ends with around the time around the 400s with Esther, Esdras, and Nehemiah during the time of halfway through the Persian Empire. This is about the 400 BC. In the Catholic Bible, it ends with the rise of the Maccabees around 160 BC. At the end of the Old Testament in both cases. However, in both cases, the New Testament begins with Rome already in control. And we also see a king in Jerusalem, Herod, who is very worried about his delicate position in power. What happened between the rise of the Persians to the very delicate situation Herod was in? Well, we totally skipped the entire Persian, the Greek, and the Hasmonean dynasties in between. Well, Flavius Josephus gives us a very detailed explanation into how Rome takes over Jerusalem and the dramatical place of power, the dramatic changes in power that led to it. Flavius Josephus wrote 5 books, 3 of them based on history, 1 of them being his biography, and the 5th one being Jewish apologetics. But we are focusing most on his classical work known as the Jewish War, where he gives a detailed explanation in the first his work has 7 volumes. The first volume describes what exactly happened between where Daniel, in the Old Testament, Daniel in the Persian Empire through the rise of the Roman Empire. That's what we're looking at right now. Chapter 7 of Flavius Josephus' Jewish War, where he is talking about the moment. Today we're going to see how exactly Rome takes over Jerusalem. And by understanding this, we slowly get to understand what's going on. Book 2 of the Jewish War describes about the death of Herod the Great and the rise of his children and grandchildren to power. But we'll see more of that later. Book 1 is how Rome takes over Jerusalem and how Herod rises to power. But right now we're going to focus on Rome taking over Jerusalem in chapter 7. It is important to understand Josephus to properly understand what's going on in the Bible. So let's dive right in and see what Flavius Josephus had to tell us about the fall of Jerusalem. But believe it or not, this fall of Jerusalem has a lot to do with the rivalry between 2 brothers. As we get ready to share the screen, let me catch you up with what we have seen thus far happening in the events. You see, This is one of the reasons why the Protestants can never fully understand prophecy or scripture, because they chose to take out the Deuterocanonicals, which they falsely call apocryphal. So they do not understand about the Maccabees. If you do not know what went on through the Maccabees, there's no way you're going to understand how Rome came to power. Because as we have been seeing during the times we've been going over Flavius Josephus, last time we saw was chapter 6 of his first book of Jewish War. We have been seeing that after the Greeks had taken over Israel and tried to impose pagan worship, the Maccabees led a revolt, which led to independence of about 120 years by the Hasmoneans, also known as the Maccabees. But around the fourth generation, we see a fight beginning to develop between brothers. And you see Hyrcanus and Aristobulus were having issues. And between their fights, there was also another Alexander Gennaeus. And the son of Alexander Gennaeus, also known as Hyrcanus II. No, yeah, Aristobulus II. Yeah, actually both of their parents. Because Alexander Gennaeus had two children. Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. And these two decided to fight over the kingdom. And this fight led to other countries stepping in. For a brief period, the Arabs had joined in supporting Aristobulus. But then, actually, they supported Hyrcanus. But then Scaurus, the representative of Rome, kicked Aretas, a king of the Arabs, out, supporting Aristobulus. But now, Hyrcanus does not want to see his brother in power. He thinks that since he is the older one, you see what's going on is that Hyrcanus is the older one, so he thinks as the older brother, he should be ruling the kingdom. But Aristobulus sees him as being a weak person, as well as his parents, Alexander Gennaeus and Alexander Salome, saw Hyrcanus as a weak person, so they all named Aristobulus, the younger brother, to the throne. But Hyrcanus never accepted because he, as the older one, as the firstborn, should be ruling the kingdom, or at least that's what he claims. So this fight between two brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, now Pompey, yes, the same Pompey who was part of the Roman triumvirate, the same Pompey who fought against Octavian, the first emperor of Rome, steps in. Let's see what happens after Pompey steps in. At this treatment, Pompey was very angry and took Aristobulus into custody. You see, Aristobulus had not long ago joined forces with Aretas. Aretas was a king of a rival country that was rival to Rome. So Pompey, being a Roman, did not feel Aristobulus's faithfulness to the interest of the Roman crown. So he arrests them. So Pompey arrests Aristobulus, fearing a possible treason down the road. That, plus he also saw Hyrcanus as a weaker ruler, easier to govern. And when he was come to the city, he looked about where he might make his attack. Okay, this is in the northeast. Just north of the Mount of Olives lies Mount Scopus. Right there, you can easily see as far west as all of modern Jerusalem and as far east as the Dead Sea. So that is a very strategic point as a lookout. It's a good point to stand to analyze and see where the weak points in the wall would be. He saw the walls were firm, that it would be hard to overcome them. The city walls were properly built, and that the valley before the walls was terrible, and that the temple, which was within the valley, was itself encompassed with a very strong wall, in so much that if the city were taken, that temple would be a second place of refuge for the enemy to retire. The Temple of Jerusalem, which is now the Dome of the Rock, was located between two different valleys. On the east, you have the Valley of Kedron, also known as the Valley of Kings. It had a very steep entrance at that time. Many of the highways which now exist did not exist then, so it was very steep entrance on the east to be able to take over Jerusalem. And on the west, there was another valley, which was 20 years after the time we're talking about. We're talking about 63 AD right now. I mean, 63 BC. What the parts we're reading about right now is about 63 BC, which is when Pompey takes over Jerusalem. Back at that time, right by where the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, is now located, there used to be another valley there. That valley has been since filled in through centuries of building and rebuilding and archaeological excavations. But we see now as the Western Wall used to be much taller, only that it looks shorter now because there is a lot underground right there. You could actually take a tour under Jerusalem and see what it looked like before. And we see that there were a lot of steep rises. Let's see what else we have to learn. So Pompey is trying to analyze how to best take over the city of Jerusalem. He sees the walls are very steep. Also, on the west, on the far west, by where we were, the Jaffa Wall is located at, by the Jaffa Gate. We notice if you were to go there, you would notice that there's also a steep valley there, and there's a bridge connecting other parts of Jerusalem to the actual entrance of it. So either way you looked at it, you had valleys surrounding Jerusalem, and the Romans were looking at the best way to attack. Also, the way that the temple wall looks wasn't there yet. Many of the walls, the actual Western Wall right now, was built 20 years later by Herod the Great. We had a wall there, but we did not have the layer of concrete on top as it does now. So the Romans were looking at the way the temple was built, and they were also looking at the way Jerusalem was built. They noticed that by attacking Jerusalem, it would be a long thing, because if the Jewish people saw Jerusalem falling, their enemies could rush to the temple and use the temple as another fortress. Let's go on to paragraph 2. Now, as was long deliberated about this matter, in a sedition arose among the people within the city. So now you have two groups of people in the city of Jerusalem fighting amongst each other. Aristobulus' party being willing to fight and to set their king at liberty. Remember, Aristobulus was arrested by Pompey, and they want to fight to get Aristobulus to be free, because they still thought Aristobulus was their king. This is the reason why later on in the book of Revelation, and this is also why it is important to properly know the context to understand prophecy. In the New Testament, in Revelation 17, he talks about kings and queens prostituting themselves to the beast. This is the reason why. If a king was willing to do as Rome wanted, they would be placed. And when I'm talking about Rome, I'm not talking about the papacy. I'm talking about the Roman Empire, about the Roman emperor who for a long time was also enemy of the church, of God's Catholic Church. So we see here Aristobulus declares himself king and was also named king by Alexander Jannaeus, his father. And because he did not get the approval of Rome, he got arrested, and later on he is executed himself. He is killed off by the Romans later on. But Hyrcanus submits to the influence of Rome. So Rome chooses Hyrcanus over Aristobulus. Why? Because Aristobulus continues calling himself king, and the people who supported Aristobulus' claim to the kingdom decided to fight against Rome and to set their king at liberty, Aristobulus, while the party of Hyrcanus were opening the gates to Pompey, while Aristobulus, claiming to be king, and his people were setting up to fight against Rome. His brother, Hyrcanus II, decides to side with the Romans and help Rome enter. So Rome enters Jerusalem without firing a single shot. It's not till after they enter Jerusalem and then they lay siege to the temple when everything starts going terrible for these for the followers of Aristobulus. While the party of Hyrcanus were opening the gates for Pompey, the people of Aristobulus of Hyrcanus wanted Roman rule because they wanted their support against Aristobulus. And the dread people were, in occasion, these last to be a very numerous party when they looked upon the excellent order of the Roman soldiers were in. So Aristobulus' party was worsted and retired into the temple and cut off the communication between their temple and the city by breaking down sorry, I lost my place. By breaking down the bridge that joined them together and prepared to make an opposition to the utmost. So what happened is Hyrcanus' people opened the gate so that the Roman army could go in. And now the army went into the gates, very disciplined. And the people of Jerusalem, seeing the order and the discipline that these Roman emperors had, that the Roman soldiers had, quickly ran into the temple, destroyed the access route, which was this bridge, and prepared to attack, prepared to defend themselves against Rome and against the siege. It mentions here that they gave them the palace. In biblical time, there used to be a fortress right next to the temple. Later on, Pompey names this fortress the Palace Antonia. And it's right next to the temple. If you are to stand on the towers of this fortress, you could see right into everything that was going on in the temple's court, in the temple's yard area. That's the palace they're talking about. So in other words, because the Romans were not able to jump in and take over, because the Romans were not able to take over the temple immediately, Hyrcanus' people gave them access to the fortress, to what was later known as Fortress Antonia, so that they could overlook the temple and be able to find a weak space where they could take control from. Let's see. Delivered the palace to him. Pompey sent Piso, one of the great officers, into that palace, that's Palace Antonia, with an army who distributed a garrison about the city because he could not persuade any of those that had fled to the temple to come to terms of accommodation. So Pompey is looking for a peace plan, but the people of Aristobulus do not want any peace unless it means to free Aristobulus. But the Romans don't want to free Aristobulus because they fear that there would be treason. So, since Aristobulus' people demanded that Aristobulus be free, and that was one thing the Romans were not willing to do, the people continued fighting. And Piso, notice he was at the garrison at the palace trying to find a weak point where he could invade and attack. He then disposed all things that were round about them so as might favor their attacks, as having Hyrcanus party very ready to afford them both counsel and assistance. In other words, Hyrcanus and his people were willing to support the Roman takeover of Jerusalem. So now they're analyzing strategically where could they go in to attack the temple and take over Hyrcanus and his people. But Pompey himself filled up the ditch that was oil on the north side of the temple and the entire valley, also the army itself being obliged to carry the materials for that purpose. And indeed, it was a hard thing to fill up that valley by reason of its immense depth, especially as the Jews used all the means possible to repel them from their superior situation. Notice this. The Romans were at the bottom of the valley, and the Temple of Jerusalem is on what's called the Temple Mount. It's up on a hill. So for the Romans to be able to take over the temple where Aristobulus' people are taking refuge, first they have to climb up that hill, then they have to climb the walls that protect the temple. So the Romans had a very difficult thing to do. So in order to save time and to save effort, the Romans decided to fill in the valley. You see that the Bible says that every hill will be brought down and every valley would be filled. Could this be part of it? The Romans are filling in every valley so that the Romans could come in and attack. But the Jewish people, Aristobulus' people, we cannot say the Jews because remember, the Jews were divided between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Aristobulus' people, from the top of the hill, they were shooting bows, darts, arrows, what have you, against the Romans who were filling in that valley. As they were, and this slowed down the process. This then made that siege quite longer. Instead of its means that, especially as the Jews used all means, succeeded in their endeavors. Nor had the Romans succeeded in their endeavors, and not Pompey taken notice of the 7 days on which the Jews abstained from all sorts of work on religious account, and raised his bank, but restrained his soldiers from fighting on. So here's what's going on. After several days in which the Romans were trying to fill in that valley, Pompey quickly noticed that on the Sabbath, Aristobulus' people would stop fighting or throwing things because of the Sabbath. Because the rules they observed did not allow any type of work, and fighting was considered work. So they were not allowed to fight on the Sabbath. At least not at this point, at least not yet. So then Pompey noticed that and ordered that the Romans would be building the ramps and filling in all the gaps they needed to fill in on Sabbath days. But he tried, or according, at least Josephus tries to present us Pompey, who wants to respect religious rights. He may be trying to speak in favor of the Romans because, after all, in fact, Josephus, though he was part of the Jewish War, once he was taken prisoner, he switched sides. Who knows if that could be one of the reasons why he is speaking kindly of Pompey. Oh, Pompey didn't want to attack, kind of thing, but we know, of course, Pompey did attack. For the Jews only acted defensively on Sabbath days. But as soon as Pompey, in other words, on Sabbath, the Jews only defended themselves, but they did not go straight out into the war. But as soon as Pompey had filled up the valley, he erected high towers upon the bank and brought these engines which they had fetched from Tyre near to the wall. So they went all the way to Tyre, in what is now Syria, and had ginormous siege machines brought towards Jerusalem, which the Romans would use to take over the walls, and that way have an easier entrance into the temple. So this must have taken a lot of time because, remember, you did not have cars. Even in today's time, it takes hours drive from Tyre to Jerusalem. And everything was being done in foot. This would have taken at least 3 to 4 months. At the very least. And even that would have been too fast. Upon the bank. But as soon as Pompey had fled in the valley, he erected high towers upon the bank and brought those engines which they had fetched from Tyre to the wall and tried to batter it down. And the slingers of stones beat off those that stood above them and drove them away. The Romans were throwing rocks through their machines, flinging stones at the people who were standing on the walls of the temple, pelting the Romans. But the towers of this side of the city made very great resistance and were indeed extraordinary both for largeness and magnificence. Now here it was that upon the many hardships which the Romans underwent, Pompey could not but admire not only the other instances of the Jews' fortitude, but especially that they did not at all intermit the religious service, even when they encompassed with darts on all sides. So now, the Romans on a Sabbath, they've already filled in the gaps. They've already filled in the valley. They brought in the siege engines. They've jumped on the walls, and now they were jumping into the temple. They were attacking the worshipers. At this moment, the worshipers were not defending themselves either because it's a Sabbath. They're defending. Any type of fighting would be desecrating the Sabbath in the Jewish point of view. And Pompey was surprised at this. They're like, we're attacking here. Sunday through Friday, they're over here ruthlessly attacking us. But all of a sudden on Friday, they're very peaceful. They go from ruthless attacks to being innocent sheep led to slaughter, not even fighting back. Complete 180-degree turn. In comparison with all darts on all sides, for as if the city were in full peace, their daily sacrifices and purifications and every branch of their religious worship was still performed to God with the utmost exactness, as if nothing was happening. Nor indeed when the temple was actually taken, and they were every day slain about the altar, did they leave off the instances of the divine worship that were appointed by their law. For it was the third month of the siege before the Romans could even with great difficulty overthrow one of the towers. So it took them 3 months. The Romans came in and it took them 3 months to fill in the valleys, to bring in the siege engine, and to climb the walls. Once they climbed the walls, total genocide broke out. The Romans were killing people left and right. The Roman soldiers had mercy on nobody. And then even when they noticed that somebody was praying, the Roman soldiers would come and kill them. And these people who were in the temple worshiping did not defend themselves, even if it was the very same person who the day before was pelting and shooting arrows at the soldiers on Saturday, being the Sabbath, they would not defend themselves. So the Romans took advantage of the Sabbath to commit such a massacre and do away with Aristobulus' people. That's how Aristobulus' people lost control and lost the war. And getting to the temple. Now that first of all ventured to get over the wall was Faustus Cornelius of Silla. This was what makes him famous. He was the first person to be able to get over the wall, and you can say the first Gentile, the first pagan to tread upon the upon temple grounds. The next after him were two centurions, Furius and Fabius. Notice these were centurions. These were very important people because each of these had 200 people under them. So at this time, you had at least 200 people invading the temple and killing people off. And every one of these was followed by a cohort of his own, a cohort being about 1,600 people. So these centurions were leading not just their own group, but a full cohort, which was almost 3,000 people. So now you have about 6,000 people. So now you have the temple being all very crowded. And yet most of those in the temple were not the worshippers, the Jewish worshippers themselves, but the pagan Romans under Pompey, who were massacring the Jewish people. I want to emphasize that when I'm talking about the Romans here, I'm not talking about the church. The Roman church, the Catholic church, did not yet exist for yet another 90 more years after what these events take place. Who encompassed the Jews on all sides and slew them, some of them as they were running for shelter to the temple, and others as they were for a while fought in their own defense. And now did many of the priests, even when they saw their enemies assailing them with swords in their hands, without any disturbance, go on with their divine worship. The priests went on sacrificing the lambs as if nothing was going on. Without any, and were slaying what they were offering their drink offerings. Notice this. The sacrifice was not just a lamb. Inside the temple, you had the bread of presence, the lechem kapanim, which included wine for libations. That's what they're talking about, offering wine. That's what part of what contributed to the modern concept of the Eucharist, the offering of wine as sacrifice. Those are the drink offerings they're talking about here. And burning their incense as firm. So they were inside the whole, just one step ahead of the Holy of Holies. They had already trodden, they had already gone into the temple. The temple had this big yard around, and then on the northern side of it, the western side of it, you had a particular building which had two chambers. The Holy of Holies, which is where the ark was supposedly held, and I'm saying supposedly because there's no evidence of the ark ever being taken by the Romans. And then before the Holy of Holies, you had the incense altar, the showbread table, and the menorah. That's where we find that the Romans are right now. They're inside the actual temple, no longer in the yard. Now they have desecrated the temple and stepped into it. And they're seeing that some priests are offering incense, and they're killing those priests right as they're offering incense or pouring out the libation wine from the showbread table. And burning their incense, preferring the duties about their worship to God before their own preservation. That means that even though they saw that they were being killed at that moment, they did not stop the worship service. They continued on with everything, even though at that time the temple had been desecrated and they were being killed inside the temple. The greatest part of them were slain by their own countrymen of the adverse faction, and an innumerable multitude threw themselves down precipices. So what we see is that along with the Romans, we have the people of Hyrcanus fighting along with the Romans against the people of Aristobulus. So we see that that these people who are trying to hold their religious services are being attacked by their own brothers. Aristobulus and Hyrcanus were brothers. They were sons of the same father. Yet they were supported by two different people. And the people who followed Hyrcanus were willing to kill their own brothers, the people of Aristobulus, as long as they could get Roman support against Aristobulus. That's how bad the rivalry between these two brothers got. It led to a civil war that ultimately ended putting brother against brother, literally. Nay, some there were who were so distracted among the insuperable difficulties they were under that they set fire to the buildings that were near to the wall and were burned together with them. Now the Jews were slain 12,000, but the Romans very few were slain, but the greater number was wounded. So some people got so confused with the action that they started setting fires, looting. Probably the same people of Hyrcanus, the same criminals who wanted to kill their own brothers just so that Aristobulus would not be king. They were the same people of Hyrcanus who we can say betrayed the Jews. And because of these people of Hyrcanus, the second, who was a traitor, the majority of those who died in this battle were Jews themselves. But there was nothing affecting the nation so much in the calamities they were under. Notice something here. Okay. They were affected the nation so much in the calamities they were under as their holy place, which had been hitherto seen by none, should be laid open to strangers. For Pompey and those who were about him went into the temple itself, whether it was unlawful for any to enter but the high priest, and saw what was deposited therein. So now, Pompey and his people, they desecrated the temple by going into it. Being Gentiles themselves, they were not allowed in the temple. By going into it, they have defiled the temple. And to make things worse, they made another defilement, because in the temple, the Holy of Holies, which not even Jews were allowed to be in, only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and only once a year during Yom Kippur. And now you have a man who's not even a Jew, let alone a high priest. He goes into the temple, defiles it, and he goes into the Holy of Holies and super defiles it. So whether it was and the candlestick with lamps and the table, this is the temple of the showbread, and the pouring vessels, the one that they were using to do the wine offering, and the censers where they used to burn incense, all made entirely of gold, as also a great quantity of spices heaped together. The spices that were offered during tithes. With 2,000 talents of sacred money, yet the sacred money was a temple tax that was used to help maintain the temple event and keep it from breaking down. Yet he not touched the money nor anything else that was there reposited. So Pompey saw it, but decided to take nothing from there as loot, which is strange, because when you go to war, when people went to war, they would take the all material things from there as loot, as a reward for fighting the war. Yet Pompey decided to respect, after having defiled the temple, he decided to respect it and defile it no more. But he commanded the ministers about the temple the very next day after he had taken it to cleanse it and to perform their accustomed sacrifices. Now, Pompey had already killed off Aristobulus' people. Many of the priests had been massacred through this. Now, Pompey has now full control of Jerusalem and full control of the temple. Pompey has no more need to continue fighting. So now he walks out of the temple, orders the remaining priests to cleanse it, to do the rituals necessary to cleanse the defilement of the temple, and to continue with the sacrifices they were doing before this massacre had taken place. Moreover, he made Hyrcanus high priest as one that not only in other respects had shown great alacrity on his side during the siege, but as he had been the means of hindering the multitude that was in the country from fighting for Aristobulus. Now, you see what's going on here? Hyrcanus, the cruel person who betrayed the Jews, was named high priest after having killed the previous high priest, Onias himself, in this terrible war. What's going on? Rome is rewarding those who helped Roman interests. We just saw that Hyrcanus betrayed his brother. Hyrcanus betrayed his country. Why? Because he wanted to rule Jerusalem. This is the reason why the Bible why the Bible talks about the great whore of Babylon. Right here, the whore, the prostitute, happens to be Hyrcanus, who sells himself out as a Jew, abandons his Jewish brothers to join sides with the Roman. This is what the book of Revelation means by the whore of Babylon. Those who would abandon their own roots, their own identities in pursuit of being liked by the Roman emperor, not by the church. The church has nothing to do with it. And even though Hyrcanus does not deserve the position of high priest because he has blood in his hands and because of the the crimes that he had committed against his own people, he gets rewarded by that position by Pompey, just because he supported Pompey, which they were otherwise very ready to have done. And because Hyrcanus kept convincing people not to support, kept people from joining more people from joining Aristobulus' side, he got those people who were not part of the fight not to join the fight because they would have joined Aristobulus. He used fear tactics, threatening to kill anybody who would join Aristobulus. So all these other people who wanted to join in the war and help Aristobulus, because of the fear of threats by Hyrcanus, they decided not to join. So Hyrcanus was both fighting against Aristobulus and threatening those who would join Aristobulus with death so that Aristobulus' numbers would not increase. So for those two actions, Pompey rewards Hyrcanus with the role of high priest, even though Hyrcanus is the farthest thing from being the appropriate high priest. And reconcile the people to him more by benevolence than by terror. Now among the captives, Aristobulus' father-in-law was taken, who was also his uncle. Aristobulus was married to the daughter of Hyrcanus the First. Notice that this Hyrcanus we're talking that was fighting against Aristobulus was Hyrcanus the Second. Now, Hyrcanus the First was the brother of Alexander Jannaeus, who happened to be the father of both Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, who are the ones fighting here. So Aristobulus II is married to the daughter of Hyrcanus I. His brother, an enemy, Hyrcanus II, is named after the father-in-law of Aristobulus, after his own father-in-law, who was taken captive and taken as a slave to Rome. So those that were the most ugly, he punished with decollation, or rewarded Faustus and those with him that fought so bravely with glorious presents, and made tribute upon the country and upon Jerusalem itself. Now Jerusalem has to pay a tax. Bear with us, we're almost done. He also took away from the nation all those cities that they had formerly taken that belonged to Celesyria. So under the Maccabees, the kingdom of Israel rose to great powers, extending their influence very far to the north. We're going to see some examples here, how large the kingdom was and what cities were taken away. Let's continue and see. Celesyria is a term that was used during the first century to refer to everything that is now Lebanon, Syria, and parts of northern Iraq. And made them subject to him that was at that time appointed to be the Roman president there. In other words, now that Pompey had taken Jerusalem, it also took the entire countryside. All the land to the east of the Mediterranean now belonged to Pompey. And reduced Judea within its proper bounds. He also rebuilt Gadara that had been demolished by the Jews in order to gratify one Demetrius of Gadara. So Demetrius of Gadara had been a slave, but he was freed because he was a favorite of Pompey. And since this former slave, now being a free person, known as a freedman, was a favorite of Pompey, Pompey shows his appreciation for Demetrius by rebuilding Gadara. And was one of them. He also made other cities free of their dominion that lay in the midst of their countries, such, as they had not demolished before the time. Hippos and Scythopolis. Scythopolis was just south of the Sea of Galilee, right on the border, right where the Sea of Galilee feeds into the Jordan River. We can actually visit the ruins of it. Such a magnificent ruins. Also Pella and Samaria and Marisa. And besides these, Ashdod and Jamnia and Arethusa, these are cities around the coast, southern coast of Israel. And in like manner, he dealt with the maritime cities as Gaza, Joppa is today's Tel Aviv, and Dora, and that which was anciently called Stratus Tower. We're talking about Caesarea Maritima, which was rebuilt by Herod and consecrated to the Roman Emperor. But before that, it was called Stratus Tower, but was afterwards rebuilt with the most magnificent edifices that had its name changed to Caesarea Maritima. Why was it called Caesarea? Because Herod the Great consecrated that city to the Roman Emperor, Caesar Augustus. All which he had restored to their own citizens and put them under the province of Syria. So now Syria was controlling territories that belonged to Israel. So the area of Syria went as far south as what is now Gaza, with his province together with Judea and the countries as far as Egypt and Euphrates. He committed to Scaurus as the governor. Notice that Egypt and other parts of Syria were controlled by Scaurus. This is in the year 63. So Syria and Egypt were controlled by the same person. Scaurus being one of the first, what later on became known as the procurators. And gave him 2 legions to support him, while he made other haste he could himself to go through Cilicia, his way to Rome, having Aristobulus and his children along with him as his captives. So, after Aristobulus lost the war, he was taken a slave to Rome, along with the 4 children he got. He got 2 sons, 2 daughters. So you see, you have Aristobulus taken captive and his 2 daughters. As for his 2 sons, one continued being captive, but one of them got away. There were 2 daughters and 2 sons, and one of which the sons, Alexander, ran away as he was going, but the younger Hyrcanus and his sisters were carried to Rome. So the older brother escaped as he was being taken captive to Rome. This older brother is later known as Alexander of Judea, and later on, when these 2 brothers cause more problems, because Alexander starts fighting. Alexander, the one who escapes, starts fighting against the other brother, who was Antigonus, who was taken to prison. So the 2 sons, Aristobulus' 2 sons were Alexander and Antigonus. And here we're going to stop because we have finished this chapter. And as always, remember, long live Christ the King!